just go with what you know. I mean, if you think about it, everyone has something zany or entertaining to tell. I have yet to meet a person that if you get them talking doesn't have a story. That's the neat part about just being alive, is everyone has a story to tell. And as far as the type of storytelling that people do, there's all kinds. There's folk tales, there's slice of life, there's, the Big Liar type stuff. I would tell people to go ahead and just start experimenting around with what you like in terms of storytelling and what people react well to.
You mentioned that you have other types of stories that you'd like to develop more besides just the tall tales. What are some of these other stories?
Well, I was kind of a latchkey kid, and I had access to a lot of stuff in the 1970s that would put you on the terrorist watch list these days. So small types of oxidizers for rocket fuels or explosives in the form of things like black powder. So just making it out of the 1970s with all my limbs attached is a story in and of itself. So those are the kind of things. And then, the high school type stories and just observations on life. I mean, one of the things that I think that I'm looking to do at some point is graduate to what I see a lot of the professional storytellers doing, which is being able to make your stories not all about me, and to bring in family stories and just other people's lives into their storytelling. So I'm still maturing in that regard and trying to get to that point.
Let's say I have an idea, something that may have happened in my life, but the more I think about it, it's just not that interesting. How can I take something from my life and really turn it into a good story?
Well, one of the ways that you can do that is you start out with the kernel of the idea. Let's take it, for example, as a Big Liar type story or a tall tale. Let me just throw out, say, getting in a fender bender as a teenager. That's kind of something that people can relate to, and I do think that that's one of the best elements of tall tales, is coming up with something people can relate to. So taking a fender bender, well, okay. So you could make that into a pretty boring story. The cop shows up and you get your ticket and you move on. That may be the real event, but what if you decided that your fender bender was with somebody famous? So you accidentally hit the presidential motorcade, for example. Well, what would happen if you did that? Would you get arrested by the Secret Service? Would the president be willing to sign your fender on your car or something like that? So you can take them in a number of different ways once you have the element of truth that you're working from. And you can turn those into very interesting stories. There is true, as you said, well, what if it's just not interesting? Well, that's okay too. There are some ideas that do not turn into stories that will be good for performance art for a number of reasons. One, if the story itself is not universally applicable, that can be a problem. Knowing your audience helps out with that. For example, stories that are told in Utah have to often deal with Utah-specific cultural items. Say like Mormon culture, Jello, on and on and on, which play really well to say an audience who shares that culture. But if you take that same story to, say, Tupelo, Mississippi, and you start talking about Mormons and their Jello, that doesn't make any sense to them, and they lose interest really quickly.
So you have to do your homework and know your audience, is what you're saying.
You definitely do have to know who your audience is. And the one thing that I think is what I've observed from the professionals who are definitely out there on the circuit, they try and tailor their stories that are interesting to, it could happen to me, or I could see myself doing that. Don Davis, as one of the kind of grand masters of storytelling, tells a little story about being sick at home with mononucleosis, and he decides that he's going to cut his curtains into a star field so that when the sun shines through, he can have stars on his wall. And you tell a story like that, and you can say to yourself, yeah, I could see myself at 8 years old doing that. And so you immediately become engrossed by it. And so, the other things that I find work really well with storytellers is if you're going to do a slice of life that's not common to what you're doing in your life, like, say, exotic travel, it's great if you bring in the sights, the sounds, and the smells, and try and bring people into where, the theater of the mind allows them to fill in the gaps. And those can be quite successful as well.
I've heard it said that the European approach to storytelling is more about folk tales and third-person narratives, whereas the American approach is usually more about a first-person narrative. Do you have any preference or thoughts between those two different approaches?
I don't really care to hear folk tales unless they're told from somebody who comes from the culture. For instance, an African American telling a folk tale from Africa is really interesting to me because I'm hearing about the cultural heritage that they share. Conversely, if I hear somebody who is Caucasian telling an African folktale, it just doesn't have the same effect because it's not their cultural heritage. So maybe that sounds a little bigoted, but it just doesn't work for me sometimes when somebody who doesn't have the cultural heritage tries out the story. They may give a perfect representation of the story with traditional instruments and everything, but for some reason it just doesn't logically work because I'm looking for the person who's from that culture. That's my personal bias. I know people who just absolutely live to hear folk tales. I'm just personally not one of them because folk tales I can't associate with the way I can with a slice of life story. I may have never grown up in the 50s, but I can picture it when you get some of these older folk tellers telling you about getting a burger and some fries hung on the side of their window at the car hop. I can get that. But if you go to Johnny negotiating with the dragon for, a golden goblet to do something magical or whatever, those for me just don't work because I can't see myself in it.
I think it definitely comes down to being an authority on the subject, and that transcends a lot more than just storytelling. You definitely have to present what you know, or it's going to fall flat.
Oh, totally. I totally agree. And that's a key characteristic of the very, very successful storytellers. They know their material inside and out, and that's something that I've always enjoyed.
Do you think that you need a persona to match your kind of stories? For example, if I'm kind of a mild-mannered guy, can I get away with telling a wild story that takes place on a rock stage?
One of the things that I would say if I had an Achilles heel as a storyteller, I tend to tell my stories with wordplay as being more important than being as active on the stage. I mean, to your credit, Stephen, when you are on the stage, you take over the stage with personality, and that's absolutely fantastic. It's a great style. And it works because you can bring in people from all audiences. I kind of go towards the Bill Lepp school of I can put my hands in my back pocket, and as long as you're following along with the timbre, the jokes, and sort of the wordplay, that you do okay. So there's room in storytelling for all types of stage presentation. For example, I don't do a lot of voices. There are other storytellers out there that's their shtick. They do a ton of voices, and you definitely know which character is on stage.
I think it's kind of hard finding the balance sometimes between less and more, and I'm impressed at what storytellers like yourself and Bill Lepp can do with being kind of dry in their presentation, but absolutely connecting with the audience. And sometimes you see people who use lots of volume, who use lots of varying pitch in their voice. They've got big eyes and their hands are all over the place. But sometimes I feel a little disconnected to them because it feels a little over the top. So sometimes it's hard striking that balance.
Well, and that is one thing that storytelling as an art, I think it does have some defined boundaries. It's not on-stage acting as much as it is story crafting. And you can be the greatest at having a projection voice that can hit everybody in the back of the arena that you're performing in. But if the story isn't good or well constructed, it doesn't matter that somebody's up on stage lampooning and jumping around and charging up to the front row of the audience to look them in the eye after a good joke. That doesn't change the fact that the storycraft wasn't good. And I think that's one of the things that people, I think, mistake about the genre is they think a stand-up comic is a storyteller. And they're really not, because they're not bringing you all the way through a story as much as they have a running punchline. And I don't necessarily consider that storycraft. That's just enough setup for a punchline, but it's not. I've yet to hear, say, a stand-up comic go 5 minutes and then give you their punchline.
Where would you say Bill Cosby fits in? Is he a storyteller or is he a stand-up comedian?
He's probably one of the few people who's made a successful bridge of that, because one thing you will see in his work is he will do mostly an overall arc. So if he's talking about the kids, it's going to be several small vignettes on the kids, like his famous, Dad is great, he gave us the chocolate cake. That's definitely one that stands out in my mind where I guess he would bridge the gap. But for instance, you take a Jeff Foxworthy, and he'll give you 2 or 3 sentences to set up the joke, and he won't return to that individual or that situation again.
Why would an audience want to hear a story as opposed to a stand-up comedian?
The best thing, I think, as a storyteller, if there's a reward, whether it's monetary or otherwise, what I enjoy most is at the end of a performance, if somebody comes up to me and says, "Oh, you just reminded me of my crazy Uncle Larry when he tried to light the gasoline fire and he burned off his eyebrows or whatever," and they re-relate a story to me as something just as zany. And I think that's the real joy for storytellers, is to hear that you've caused somebody to think about the stories of their life. I'm not sure that necessarily you get that out of a comedian. You might find yourself around the water cooler the next day relating the joke that they told, but I don't necessarily believe that they're busy relating stories around the water cooler.
To me, when I'm listening to a good storyteller, it's more of a journey. It takes me somewhere, I really visualize it, and I feel like I've exerted myself at the end of it, and when it reaches a climax and a conclusion, you really feel a sense of fulfillment. And I think it is because it has that narrative structure with a beginning, middle, and end that takes the audience with you.
Yeah, it's totally what makes it the most amazing performance art. And the one thing that I've seen over the years, and I bought a bunch of storytelling CDs from a lot of the artists that I've enjoyed, but I have found that even though they are word perfect in their story, that there's been some redub to collect flub lines up and get them out of the recording. They just don't have the same impact as actually being there. And I love that, because I'm a technology geek. I work with tech all day long, every day. But storytelling as an art is always going to be a person-to-person venue. Yeah, maybe 3,000 people in the audience, but they're there, they're connected, and you are able to react to the audience, and likewise they can react to you.
At the Timpanogos Storytelling Festival, maybe the National Storytelling Festival, you will get some big audiences, but most of the time, I think even for the big pros, the audiences are going to be relatively small and intimate. So it's not so much about the glory as it is a love of the art form for this.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, it's an art form that a lot of people don't understand is just absolutely fantastic. I've brought in, at least every year over the last 5 years, new people to storytelling. And it was really funny. I brought a friend in last year, and Don Davis was relating a bunch of stories that he had told when he first came to Tim, 20-odd years ago. And this person was just basically verbatim giving me back all those stories, almost as a little kid who'd been to the circus. And it's fun to see that when people actually embrace the art form of storytelling and get hooked.
I remember when I was going to the National Storytelling Conference this last year, I was at the airport, and the guy at the rental car office was asking, "So where are you going?" And I said, "I'm going to the National Storytelling Conference." And he gave me a blank stare and says, "Well, what do you guys do there?" And I said, "Well, we tell stories." And he's like, "Is this for kids?" And I said, "No, it's for adults." And he gave me more of a blank stare. And, "What else do you do?" And I said, "Well, we talk about telling stories." And then he said, "No, seriously, what do you do?" So it's funny how new it is to a lot of the world. A lot of the world is just, I think, so used to technology being our entertainers that I think we have lost this hearthfire tradition.
Oh yeah, I totally agree with you, and I've had the same reaction from people when they come in and see the shovels, and I say, "Well, I'm Utah's biggest liar," and they look at me and they say, "Well, what is that?" And then I give them a 15-second kind of synopsis of what it is and just a snippet of the story, and of course around work they all say, "Oh, he's going to tell us another story," but it's fun because they understand that life is pretty entertaining all the way around, and your attitude about things that happen to you in life can be drastically changed if you're looking for the story that goes along with it. And even events that involve tragedy can be, well, not always humorous, but there's a lot